name is Miss Army, and for the next few minutes, I'll be your teacher, and we'll be learning about Unit 2, Research Methods, Thinking Critically with Psychological Science. To start us off, hindsight bias, the tendency to believe after learning an outcome that one would have foreseen it. They call this, I knew it all along. Also, overconfidence is a human's quality to be more confident than correct when asked a question. Both of these can lead us to overestimate our intuition. An example is when Taylor Swift says, I knew you were trouble when you walked in. Did she really know? Nope, just hindsight bias. Next up, scientific attitude. Someone who is performing psychological research needs to have this. So a scientific attitude is a curious eagerness to skeptically scrutinize competing ideas and an open mind to humility before nature. This leads to critical thinking, which examines assumptions, discerns hidden values, evaluates evidence, and assesses outcomes. This way, we can eliminate nonsense. Next up, someone with a scientific attitude uses the scientific method. This is when we have a question and a theory, a hypothesis, which is a testable prediction, and a test with a replicable experiment. Different studies are used in the scientific method, including case studies when one person is studied in depth of hope of revealing universal principles. This isn't always the best option because everyone's different. A survey, a certain self-reported attitudes and behaviors of a group. We've all taken a survey before. We know what it is. And next up is a naturalistic observation, observing and recording natural behavior without controlling the situation. All of these must use random sampling and proper wording to avoid bias. Next up, correlations. In studies, we can find correlations. This is a statistical measure of how closely two things vary together. Correlation is not causation, though. Correlation can only predict the likelihood of a cause and effect relationship. But no matter how strong a relationship is, nothing can be proven. We look at scatter plots, like this one here, to see relationships. And sometimes an illusory correlation is perceived, but non-existent. So now, how to create an experiment to learn a cause and effect. So we randomly assign subjects to a control group or an experimental group. Sometimes we use a placebo effect, which is when the recipient assumes a substance is an active ingredient when it's not. This would be a pill that is literally made of nothing. We always have to determine an independent variable, a dependent variable, and any confounding variables, which are outside variables that could affect our results. And sometimes people use a double-blind procedure, which is when the subjects and researchers do not know who is receiving each treatment. How to describe data. You should know most of these by now. If not, take a stats class. Mode, the most frequent occurring score in a distribution. Mean, arithmetic average of a distribution. Median, middle score of a distribution. Range, difference between highest and lowest scores. Standard deviation, a computed measure of how much scores vary around the mean score. And then a normal curve, which is a symmetrical bell-shaped curve where approximately 68% of the data is within one standard deviation of the mean. Next up, when is it safe to generalize from a sample? Well, representative samples are better than biased samples. Duh. Less variable observations are more reliable than those that are more variable. More cases are better than fewer to equally represent our population. Statistical significance is when a statistical statement of how likely it is that an obtained result occurred by chance. To sum it up, resulting principles from experiments can help explain everyday findings. Psychologists want to find general principles that help explain many behaviors. Sometimes we find differences throughout cultures and gender, but underlying processes are all the same. And lastly, in experiments with humans, informed consent is required. Also, after the experiment, debriefing must occur to explain that was done. There we go. You're a genius on Unit 2. You're welcome.